So Emily,
So Danny,
last time we met, lots happened. I've had a tumor removed from my forehead. It's out of here. I'm not a unicorn anymore.
it's out of here. You're cancer free.
Cancer. Well, it was never cancer.
Kidding.
You're teaching,
I am. That's probably why I look more tired.
and now we're back into an episode. And what are we talking about?
We're back, baby. We're talking about forgiveness, and this actually we didn't talk about this in our season plan, but I've had a pretty intense week in regards to things that I need to think about forgiving when it comes to my church story.
And you're like, the podcast is the place to process it.
There's a comedian, really quick, and she's like, therapy is the best thing that ever happened to me, because now when my girlfriend says something to piss me off, I'm just like, I don't have to talk about it right now. I'm saving this for Linda.
That's funny.
But yeah, this is pretty vulnerable, but I also think that this is what we want to do here, is make a space that
Sure.
while we're processing together, I think that hopefully other people can maybe relate.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been the most kind of interested in and excited about is like the number of people that have reached out and said something to the effect of, like, by hearing your stories and your thoughts and real life experiences, like, not only giving me freedom to share mine, but realizing like there's value in those things. And so that's why, even though it's a vulnerable thing to talk about, and I'm interested and excited to hear what we're going to talk about today and dive into that conversation, but I think just by virtue of sharing it, like, we're inviting other people into that space, which is, again, the whole point of what we're doing here.
And like those comments too have made me see that my story isn't as unique as I thought, which makes me feel a lot less alone. Like, because I told you, like, I was like, yeah, we can talk about my story, but I kind of came from the Reformed movement, so no one probably relates to that.
Yeah.
And then people are like, no one talks about coming from more of the way that you came from and what that looks like. And anyway.
Did I tell you that I like FaceTimed with someone? Her name was Diana. She like found our podcast. She's like a Reformed deconstructor, I guess.
Shout out to Diana.
Diana, what's up? She found us on TikTok and she like went to her, she works at a church. She's a worship leader, worship director, and went to her pastor and was like, hey, I see you follow this guy on Facebook. Do you know him? And like, him and I are really good friends. But that was like such an interesting thing for me too, to be like, oh man, like there are people that are engaging in this conversation that we would have never known. And the world is just like getting smaller as this community getting bigger, which is cool.
Which is so sweet. And like, even I went to a bar to do an open mic last night, and the bartender was like, been loving the pod, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, it was so sweet.
I like that.
Because she was like, more people need to be talking about this. And I was like, oh, I know. So I feel like we're just kind of patting ourselves on the back, but I guess I want to say, like, it goes both ways. Like, when people say kind things to us, that also really does a lot for me and making me feel less alone.
Yeah, and I think like this, even though we're doing this in pursuit of helping others, part of it is our own journey through this as well. It's like we're doing this in a public forum, but there's personal progress and growth and healing that's happening for us. It's not like this isn't a vacuum of us just like talking about a hypothetical. Mm-hmm. It's like something that's real life. So, so forgiveness though.
So we're gonna like back it up way more, and then come back. Okay. Yeah. Go with it.
No. I had like a rap line in my mind that I was going to go with, and I was like, not going to do it. So
I thought you were saying nope to what I wanted to do. Nope. I was like, okay, well, good episode. So we had Rabbi Josh Stanton come to the well recently, and incredible. And I was driving to church that day, and I was thinking, like, I really need to work on forgiving, like, some people in my life that have really harmed me, like some church leaders that have really harmed me. And I was like, Emily, you just gotta frickin' forgive. And
this was like on your own, like this had nothing to do with
vibing. Yeah. It'll connect to.
Okay, yeah, cool.
And then I was talking to Rabbi Josh Stanton. I don't know what to.
You can call him Josh or Rabbi.
I call him all that.
Yeah.
Every time, all three. And I don't even know how this came up, but he was like, we're not actually required to forgive. He was like, it's a really good idea for you to find freedom and to have harmony among other people. But like he was like, our job is to go to our brother that we have harmed, try to find like reconciliation, but that person does not have to forgive you, and then it becomes like your reconciliation with God.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I may have started crying, but I was just like, oh my gosh, like I felt this like weight lifted off my shoulders of like, maybe I don't. Forgiveness doesn't feel very genuine if it feels required.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, I think about that. There are lots of, not I say this like sounds dramatic, but there's lots of people in my life that I've looked back on that have hurt me, and the forgiveness that has been given out, and the people that I've hurt, like you can tell when it's genuine and when it's disingenuous, and when it's just like a box that's checked, or when it's like the person is like genuinely like remorseful. I guess that makes sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think comes out of the idea, like, is it required, or is it an outpouring of like, I feel like I want to like engage in the reconciliation act of forgiveness.
But I always saw it as like, this is going to be a really negative way to say it, but this is how I'm trying to describe it, is I always saw the cross and God's ultimate forgiveness of us as almost like it blackmailed us into having to forgive everybody.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, you know that there's a passage, or I think Jesus tells a story where he's like, you know, this one guy forgives a big debt, and then the guy that was forgiven doesn't forgive like the $5 debt or whatever. And then the guy who forgave the huge debt is like, well, screw you, dude. Like, you didn't get the heart of this.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that Jesus doesn't talk about that. Like, the disciples ask, how much should we forgive? And he goes like, and Peter's like, 7 times? And Jesus is like 70 times 7. Like, which is just way bigger. He's not saying 490.
Great math.
Thank you. But because of that, like, people would always say like, well, you've been forgiven so much that you have to forgive others.
Yeah. That's interesting. How much is like I've like really never thought about the idea that like my necessity, I guess, for lack of a better term, to forgive others is predicated by like, because I would have never used the term blackmailed, but I think I get where you're going.
It's
so
not
like
a perfect term.
Yeah. And I'm not, but how much is that? Cause that sounds like it's maybe an inherently negative term. Like, even if that's not the right word that you're using. And so how much has that impacted your like pursuit of not just seeking, but extending forgiveness? Like, have you found that played out in real life ways as you've either sought or extended forgiveness to others?
Yes. Okay. So, and that's interesting, because I bet like if we change the word with like Jesus's sacrifice, like compels me to forgive or encourages me to forgive, like that's lovely. And instead, like I used a pretty negative term.
Yeah,
And it
inherently
feels,
more fluffy than blackmail.
Yeah. I mean, and blackmail feels pretty true to how I feel, or like pressures, like something of like, it's not organic and genuine, it's a requirement. And so I'm going to actually we're going to get there. When I was, let's say 6,
let's say 7.
Somewhere around there. I had a carpooling buddy, like, who we would switch off who drove who to school. You know, you get it?
It's like super early to be driving.
Like the parents.
Yeah,
like,
I gotcha.
And the boy who we would drove just really, really pissed me off all the time. And so one day I brought into the car this like booklet of paper, and I just wrote the kid's name and then bad book. And I was just like, I'm going to tally every time. I forgot about this. I'm going to tally every time you make me mad. And if we get to the end of this book, you have to come see my musical. Which
is the ultimate punishment.
The ultimate punishment. And he was like, no! I forgot about that. I wasn't planning on telling this story, but I remember being like, this is perfect. Like, this will help him understand that he's pissing me off. And this was actually really interesting, is my parents found out about the bad book, and they were like, Emily, you really can't do that. And I was like, and then my dad brought the phone book up to me, and he goes, Emily, if God made a if God made a bad book of us, like, this wouldn't even begin to cover it. And you know what he said? Like, but he doesn't hold that against us. Like, imagine if God was constantly doing that.
Sure.
And I was like, oh, crap. That was really, like, I was like, yeah, that's a good point. Is that the gospel has no longer become God is holding all of my crap against me. But that didn't actually heal my relationship with this kid.
Yeah,
right?
He was still a jerk.
He was just annoying.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, but now but it was that start of the gospel being like, well, I guess I have to think that you're great.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Like, and are you being hyperbolic? Like, did you go from like, I think you're annoying to now I have to think you're great? Because I don't see that being inherently connected to forgiveness. Like, I can still think you're not wonderful.
I don't think I'm being hyperbolic. I don't think that was reality, but I think that's what I thought.
Okay. Interesting. So have you seen that then continue to be breathed into how you've engaged with, because like, I think it's interesting. We've covered topics like our sin and our badness and depravity. Mm-hmm. And that phone book would entail an assertion, at least, that we're pretty awful. If we have no one uses phone books anymore, but they're big ass books. Yeah. And so it's like, that's a lot of sins to have in there, right? And so Absolutely. Then to be like, because the implication of that is God is so generous that God would forgive a phone book sized, like 10-point font book of our sins. Mm. And then you should do that for others. And so, like, I'm verbally processing a little bit, but like, have you seen the intersection of those things? Like your understanding of like total depravity and forgiveness?
That's interesting.
Because like for me, like as you think, like I haven't always been like, man, I'm a jacked up, messed up person. So like for me, and I'm not great at forgiveness. I'll say like, I don't know if I said this on the podcast, but I hold grudges like worse than most people. Like it's one of my least redeeming characteristics is I'm really bad at it. And I've been watching the Derek Jeter documentary, and he's like, I won't be mean to you. But like once you've crossed me, you're just like out of my inner circle. That's kind of how I am. Like I won't be mean to you, but it's hard for me to let you back in. Mm-hmm. And I, though, have had to wrestle with like the idea of like, there are so many things I've done, even I'm not like totally depraved, that have like pushed me outside of God's inner circle, in the sense that like I've chose myself so many times in really negative, detrimental ways that like when I think about those people, I don't feel like you said like blackmailed into doing it, but I'm like, but I do feel compelled would be the word I would use, to be like, man, like my creator is so gracious that I would be forgiven for like continually choosing myself over God. So why wouldn't I do that for other people? But I don't know. Yeah.
So part of the rhetoric around total depravity, I'm not saying this is everybody says this, but like sometimes it can come across as God is disgusted by you, but like because of Jesus.
Yeah, you've talked about the idea that like God is like utterly disgusted by us and just kind of puts up with us.
But so that doesn't feel like very organic forgiveness.
Yeah.
That doesn't feel like an outpouring of love. Sure. Even though we could say like, well, that's a really loving thing to do. That didn't come from a place of like, God loves Emily so much that he forgave her. It's this like, God is like, oh my gosh, well, I guess I chose you, so I have to deal with you.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of joking, but I'm kind of not. And so I didn't feel like the forgiveness I received from God was very organic. Like almost like he was required to do it too.
Yeah. Well, I've had conversations with people recently where they're like, the least gracious and loving and forgiving thing to do would be to send your son to die as that sacrifice. Like, does that play into it at all for you? Like, because I don't know that I agree. I would not say I don't agree with that idea, but I've had conversations with people that like, a loving God would never do this. And so therefore it's like not that great of an act of forgiveness, because like you said blackmailed, like the idea of this person was like Jesus was like coerced into doing this.
I don't believe Jesus was coerced into doing that. Like, I know, like it says, like, for the joy set before him. Like, I do believe that the story of the Bible is the story of God wanting to be with his people.
Sure.
We see in the Garden of Eden God walking with man, and at the end it says, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. That's the story. And so Jesus is, it's hard to say, don't really know what I think about that anymore. But whatever. Like, I felt like God, not that Jesus was coerced into it, but that Jesus was like, this is going to be brutal, but I'm going to do it. Which is fine, because For some reason, it was like Jesus was chill with it, but God was like, oh, God. God meaning the Father.
Sure.
I'm getting a little mixed up, honestly.
Yeah, it's confusing.
But okay, so let's talk about why this came up, because then I think we can unpack all this a lot.
Yeah.
I think we could speak in generalities for a half an hour, because this is really interesting. But so basically, I talked about this in an earlier episode in this season, about 2 summers ago, having an internship that was really rough.
Yeah, I remember, because I mistimelined it and I felt like a
You were
real
like,
jerk.
oh, so that was like a few weeks ago. You didn't say that.
Yeah.
And I don't remember how much I explained on that episode, but basically it was just like very lonely.
Yeah.
Very like I was far away from home. It was during COVID. It was virtual. But I was supposed to be there, and then I basically asked, like, I'm doing virtual VBS, I'm doing virtual Bible studies with kids, like, can I just do this from home with my family during COVID instead of live alone, really far away from them? And basically my boss said, no, I think you need to have a hard summer.
Right.
And so I did. I did stay. He was like, you can quit or you can stay. And I was like, well, I'm not going to quit. I'm not a quitter.
Right.
And so that was really intense. And then I was like, okay, this is going to be a hard summer, but like, I guess I need to learn that. Fast forward, we'll go into a little bit more. So then, and also there was a lot going on, like the senior pastor had left. So my boss was the only pastor at that point.
Yeah.
So it was rough for a lot of people. And then my boss was saying, when we hire the new senior pastor, everything will be fine. Like, then I'll have time for you. Because he was basically like, you run the children's ministry. I like don't have the capacity for that.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of trust, and I appreciated that. And he was like, but when we hire the new pastor, everything will be fine. And like, I'll have time for you to meet with you and see how you're doing, talk about the work you're doing. And I was like, perfect. I just need a little bit of like care while I'm doing this. And then he hired his best friend, or the presbytery did. He didn't hire it on his own. But, and so then I was like, okay, July rolled around, like, now this won't be so lonely. But then when that new pastor was hired, it was still lonely because he was just hanging out with his friend.
Yeah. You were not part of the collective and the friendship, right?
No, and I was like, most days I was like left alone at the office. And then I had to go home by myself. And wasn't really allowed to see people because I needed to set a good example as a church employee during COVID. And that was really rough.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the summer, I was leaving. It was my last day. I was leaving. And he said, I know I basically ignored you all summer, but I hope that you can be grateful and encouraged instead of frustrated and angry. And I just was like, okay.
Yeah.
And he was like, in a few weeks after we both cool off, I like will call you and we can like process more. And I was like, that sounds perfect. That's probably what we need to do. Because that was my second summer with that church. I didn't say that part. The first summer was fantastic.
Same guy.
Same guy.
Okay.
So that was also hard, right? Like that was...
Yeah, different sides at the same coin. Like you knew this person one way and they were very different the second time around.
Yeah, and I had a lot of like trust for that person and a lot of that. And so I get back and I was like, that was a really brutal summer. I cried most days by myself, was super lonely, honestly got really depressed. But I was like, that's okay. I'm almost done. When I leave and go back home and go to college, like I'll be fine again.
Sure.
Because then I was going into my junior year, I think. And basically every time I was alone, I would like get really bad anxiety attacks, was like super depressed.
Yeah.
Like mentally so bad. And basically ended up, thankfully it was an all online semester because I spent that whole next semester actually at home. Because I couldn't be alone.
Yeah.
I would just, and even still, it was my birthday, I remember, and we were having such a great day. We were about to go to a comedy club. It was my first comedy club experience. I was turning 21, and I just started bawling. And I was like, I don't know why. Ended up, like, starting therapy and getting on antidepressants. Like, so, like, we got there. But it was really brutal. Like, that really, really affected me.
Yeah.
And recently, in the past few months, I guess, that story had still been coming up in therapy. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I'm so annoyed. That was so long ago. I'm ready to be over it. Because also, after that summer happened, I had other pastors in my life, another pastor in my life be like, well, Emily, that's kind of on you. You should have quit.
Right.
And so then I was like, so then I felt like it was my fault that I was feeling this way. And it was just a lot. It was really rough.
Yeah. It felt like both sides were coming at you. Like, it was like you were wrong for staying and wrong for not leaving.
And I was exhausted and burnt out. And this, not my summer boss, but then the other pastor was like, how many people have you met with? And I was like, I don't have it in me. And I would really appreciate it if you didn't ask me that. Like, yeah, it felt like I was just still someone being used for, like, ministry and not cared for at all. All that to say, it was very rough and very intense and still holds a lot of weight to me. And I was really frustrated by that. And basically, I heard recently that my old boss in the summer had a conversation with someone else in my life about that summer with me. Like, he found out that it was really rough for me. And he was like, well, I gave her an out. Like,
to, like, quit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's true, sure. And he was like, and I set those expectations that it would be like that. Mm-hmm. And honestly, she had a pretty bad attitude that summer. And, like, all of these things, it was because people have said to me, I didn't say that. He never called me.
I think everyone listening was wondering the same thing, because I was wondering if he ever called you to debrief.
So I was waiting to be called. He never called me. Maybe I could have called, but I kind of just had some hope in me that he would call.
Yeah, I mean, and I want you to continue the story, but the initiative's on him. He's the lead. Right. Not lead pastor, but he was the supervisor. Like, he had set the expectation this would happen. Like, that's not on you. Like, yeah.
And then it kind of felt too late. Like, once I was like, I don't think he's going to call me, then it felt like, well, I felt embarrassed that I was still upset about it.
Yeah, for you to call and be like, oh, she's not over it. Like, she's still dwelling. Like, it would have rehashed, like, what you already felt maybe shame to some degree about while you were there for feeling the way you did.
And so he and I have still not spoken about it.
Okay. But he's spoken to other people about it.
And he was like, well, if Emily has an issue, then that's on her. Mm-hmm. Like, she can come to me. So, yeah, so it was like, now it's on me to come to him, but I really don't want to have that conversation.
Right.
Because it feels like that's not going to go well after what he said to other people.
Yeah. So so where are you at? Because I don't know if I've heard you say this part yet, but, like, where are you at in the process? Because, like, the conversation on the topic is forgiveness, right? And
right.
This spurred that. So are you in a place where you're, you know, I'm unable to forgive. I don't want to forgive. I don't think I need to forgive. I really want to. Like, where are you in all of that?
So I had therapy yesterday. Love it. And we talked about this. I came in and she was like, I can tell you have something you want to talk about. And I, like, was telling her how I was feeling, and she was like, and I was like, and I feel like I have to forgive, but I was like, if I'm being 100% honest, I want him to be just a villain in my story.
Oh, interesting.
And I was like, because that's more black and white.
Yeah.
Like, that is so much easier. And she was like, in reality, it was a hard dynamic, because basically she wasn't defending him, but she was like, can we think maybe why he would do that? Or maybe did he know all these things? Or, like, what, he was having a hard summer too. Not to excuse it. Like, she was like, if I was in that church staff, I would absolutely be like, you're really messing up on, like, caring for Emily.
Sure.
And she was like, but we're doing this work so that he doesn't stay just a villain. But I was like, but it's way easier if he just stays that way. but also I'm still so upset about it and I don't know how to let go of it. That's where I'm at today.
Yeah. Well, that's where I hear the shift, even the conversation in regards to forgiveness. Like, at this point, you guys may never, like, forgiveness in the act of that is releasing, right? Like, that's a release. And for you to hold him as the villain is still letting that situation and the negativity of it, not to say I don't know this person for anyone, but you're letting him in that situation still hold power. And so forgiveness in some ways isn't just being like, hey, I think that you rock and I forgot what you did, but it's releasing what happened so you can, because to hold him as the villain or anyone in that, like there's still people in my life. So I'm not saying I'm crushing this at all, because there are people that I still hold as the villain in parts of my life. And I'm actually, and I know this at a cognitive level, that I'm doing myself a spiritual disservice and an emotional disservice by doing that.
To me, this is what I can't separate and why I'm having such a hard time, is to me, to forgive or to let go or to de-villainize him equals invalidating my experience. And I know that's not true, but that is like, I feel like for me to say, well, it was fine, I don't want to downplay the fact that this really messed me up for a while.
Yeah. But forgiveness isn't approval, right? Like, approval? Like by extending forgiveness, you're not saying I approve the acts that you did. They can still be awful, hard, painful acts. But you're saying, again, like, this is my perception, and you can agree, disagree, or be neutral. I think forgiveness is saying those acts no longer have a hold over me. Like, you can still think that those are really bad, negligent, whatever word you want to use. But forgiveness isn't approval. Forgiveness is like, this isn't a part of my story anymore in a way that drives who I am.
Yeah, but it's like, what is the, like, that's a great thought. I've never thought about forgiveness that way. And the idea of like letting go or just.
So you only thought of forgiveness as approval. Like, to forgive is to approve.
To forgive is to deny that thing happened.
That's interesting. But I think about like Jesus, right? Like, and like, I think this is a Jesus podcast. Can we talk about him? So
I guess.
Like, I think about him, like, he's like, I think about forgiveness and like the way he interacts with certain people. Oftentimes he says like, neither do I condemn you, but also like go like, so he doesn't forget, but he's also like, don't do that anymore. So if Jesus is the ultimate extender of forgiveness in the sense that like we live in a cosmic world full of sin, he didn't say, I'm just going to pretend like this never happened anymore. He's like, I just don't condemn you for this, but also I'm challenging you to not live in that way anymore. And I think, I wonder where our role at the micro level of that is. Like, how do we say, neither do I condemn you for this, but like, it happened. And so it's like, it's still going to inform my story, but not in a way that I'm holding it against you.
And I love that idea, but what is the process of that?
Oh, that's above my pay. I don't have a great process for that.
Like, what? Like, okay, great thought. To me, it's not like, oh, cool, now I've let go.
Yeah. Well, I think about, like, again, like the people that I can pull in my life, I still have, like, and I bet you get this in yours, like, there are certain things that will trigger responses. A great example, without getting into like too much detail, like, I remember when I went through my divorce, there was a certain place that I would drive by that would immediately trigger visceral reactions of like pain. Sometimes I would just start crying, like, because of things that I like that were tied to that and as it related to my divorce. Part of like I remember though, I drove by it years later and it was like, I remembered that place, but it didn't hold that over me anymore. And so I don't know the process, but like part of the process was like crying, and part of the process was being upset, and part of the process was naming it. But then there was a point where I was like, I now know that it happened, and there's some marker of my story that's laid there, but it doesn't cause me to, I'll say stumble, but I don't mean it in like it doesn't cause me to like, because I think when I drove by those spaces, I would be like, man, like I would get thrust into my own level of like sin in whatever ways of like self-doubt, of anger, of pride, of all these things, right?
Yeah.
And now I go by, it's like, that thing happened. This place holds something for me, but it's not leading me down a path of destruction in some ways, which is what would happen when I went down there.
Yeah, and that one thing that my therapist did say is I was saying, like, it's frustrating that this still bothers me. And she was like, however, right after that happened, you were super depressed. Like, she was like, and that's our body's way of saying, so I don't feel something, I'm just going to not feel anything. Like, sure. I'm going to push a lot down. And she was like, so this is the first time I've heard you talk about this story and seem, like, alive. And she was like, so there's a sense in which you're just starting.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, so I'm not, like, crazy and being sensitive or, like, need to get over it. And she was like, no, I think this is a process that I think actually is just starting, even though this was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, like, because it sounds like what you're saying is part of it is time.
Part of it's time, but also, like, going back to what I would say, at least some way shaped your theology of forgiveness, I don't think it was, like, pretending like it never happened. I think, like, owning it and naming it is a part of, like, that paired with time and naming it and processing it. Like, that's what I think was one, like, the reason, or I don't know why Christians have pushed back on therapy for so long, because it's like you're naming and you're processing in real time the things that have hurt you. Mm-hmm. And I think, like, that's what you're doing. And so I think, like, you're actually engaging in real time in the act of forgiveness by virtue of talking through it with others, and not, like, moving out of, like, well, I'm just going to pretend like no one, either this person's only a villain, so, like, that's a character, or being like, well, the response is just pretend like, because I bet, and maybe this is wrong, but was there a point where you're like, the right, good Christian thing we do is to forget, like, did you go in a place like, well, it was fine? Did you ever go into a space like that? Yeah. Do
you remember somewhere in season 2, I go, forgiveness or whatever?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I was like, sorry I said that. Yeah. That's pretty much how I feel.
Okay.
Of, like,
yeah,
I have to do this thing. Like, I remember maybe you agree with this. This is how Tim Keller talks about forgiveness, is he says, so let's say all sin comes with a cost. So, for example, if I run my car into your garage is broken. You have 2 options. You can either say, you need to pay for the garage, or I'll pay for the garage. An option is not just to let the garage be broken. And so someone has to pay. And so what I took that is like, so forgiveness is me taking on all the pain and paying, and no one else, like, but I think what we want is, like, if I drove into your garage, the dream would be, like, for you to pay for it, but also we still have but also I still say, like, dude, that was totally my B. You know, like,
yeah.
Like, that is better than just you paying for it and us pretending it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Which is what I feel like forgiveness is it's like, is the paying for it, is the you taking on all of the hard feelings.
I feel that way sometimes. Like, I feel like we've talked about this and the cost of different things and the burden of things. And so I don't know that it's like it's a 100% enjoyable burden-free act. I might agree with that.
Sure. But I don't know. It's like,
from what I heard you say, though, it wasn't even like someone had to pay for fixing the garage. You were kind of being like, the best thing to just pretend like the garage was never broken, and then we just go on it. Like, that's what it sounded like you were saying in terms of, like...
In terms of my story?
Yeah. It was like, if I just pretend like the garage was never hit, then it wouldn't... Like, I don't have to... Like, I'll just go park my car in the street.
Yeah, 100%. But also, like, there's a cost to that.
Yeah, you don't get to use your garage.
Yeah. So I'm still... What?
You're like a big metaphors person, and I just maybe I was start thinking about it.
But it's like, I'm still paying a price even if I'm not fixing the garage.
Yeah, that's right. There's a cost.
I hate that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. But I think this is like important to process because I think a lot of us feel this way about forgiveness, but we don't frickin' say it. What's up, Dustin?
The thing about...
Are you gonna roast me?
No. But the thing about you having to pay when you don't release it, when you don't forgive, you're continuing day after day. It's like you're in purgatory. You're continuing to pay for it over and over and over because that dude that hurt you perhaps never thinks about it, and you think about it. Seems like fairly regularly. We're talking about it today. You talked about it with a therapist, and that's the key for you to have the closure or the release of this thing, not to free him from the thing he did. It's allowing you to move on, and that's actually freedom for you.
Yeah.
Help at being able to forgive him, whatever that means, wherever in the soul level that happens, is your ability now to go, oh, I'm free of this. You don't have anything over me anymore. Yeah. You can't control my thoughts. And not that he even is. He might not even know. And this is the things I go through, as well. I think all humans do. And I have a villain in my story. And he can either stay the villain, or I could just stop caring that he doesn't say he's sorry and move on,
And I'm sorry, I love that idea. Like, I get, in my brain, I can say that freedom or that forgiveness is actually the most loving thing I can do for myself. In my brain, I get that. But in reality, like, what does that look like? Like, this is so, none of this is very concrete. And that's what's hard. Is like, I can totally say, yeah, that would make me feel freedom to not think about it. But how do I prevent myself from thinking about it? I need to find a way to like let it go, but not feel like I'm invalidating. But again, these are all like things we're doing in our brain.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think, Dustin, you said what I was trying to go to too. Is like forgiveness, I think, is more of a you thing or us thing than is the other person thing.
For sure.
And in some ways it's the other, but like there are times I think where people really need to be forgiven, right? They need to hear that they are. So I don't mean it's only an individual act. But I get what you're saying. Like, it's a cognitive exercise in the sense that like, you're like letting him like live rent free in your mind, right? Like he's just like there. Yeah. And like, that's kind of what I view it as. It's like, he gets to take up space in your story, and he doesn't know about that, but like that moment does. And I just wonder like what it would cost you. And I get what you're saying. So I'm going to say this before I say what I say. Like, I get that you're like, well, I understand, do this, don't do that. Like you're saying, how do I actually do this? So I don't know that I have the answer for that, but like, I do wonder, I think it costs more to let that moment or individual or thing live rent free in your space rather than to move on. You know what I mean? Like, it's what would it cost you to be like, I forgive you, versus what would it cost you to be like, I have to think about this every day, because it's costing you mental space.
Can I say one thing really quick? Is like, I think the problem though is what it is for me is I feel like he will live rent free in my head until I feel like I'm not crazy for being this hurt.
I get that.
And the problem is that I don't think I'm crazy, but my opinion doesn't matter that much to me.
Who do you think thinks you're crazy though? Like, that's interesting. Like, if you're like, because you say, I think, like, does someone other than him having those conversations, like, do you hear that rhetoric kind of going around like you're crazy for feeling hurt still?
After it first happened, a lot of people were like, this makes sense to be sad about this for like a few weeks, but then you'll be fine. And so for it to be 2 years later, almost, I haven't really been willing to tell anyone I'm still feeling this way, because I'd be like, yeah, you're right, in a few weeks I'll be over it. And we're here 2 years later. And I didn't think about it those whole 2 years. It comes back in moments that really suck. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I'll be house sitting and just start crying because I'm alone in a big house again. And this reminds me of like, it's triggering like that. I don't know how to like, there's got to be something to the effect that like, I value my experience as enough of a reason that my experience is valid. But for some reason I need like This was also interesting in therapy. I was like, I need people on my team, because I felt like I was Emily against the world during that summer. And my therapist said, well, Emily, what does it look like for someone to be on your team? And I said, if I'm being 100% honest, what it looks like for someone to be on my team is to also see that person as a villain. And that's hard.
So you don't necessarily feel unvalidated by yourself. You want other people to help validate.
But my validation of myself isn't enough.
Right. And it sounds like the lowest on the totem pole.
Absolutely.
That's just, Dustin, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just wondering, I wonder if a tangible option, and it might not be, but a tangible option could be to write out, write a letter to him and say, this is how that time made me feel, but I want you to know that I don't want this on my shoulders anymore, and so I'm gonna forgive you for this. But the act of writing it down and saying, I forgive you, even though he didn't ask. And it seems like what you want from him is for him to feel badly about what happened, because he's the villain, right? And to come to you in a very honest, humble way and ask you to forgive him. That would be closure. That'd
be the dream.
Right?
And it's what I thought, it's what I was kind of promised.
Right. And he didn't do that. So then the question is, how do you take the power back and forgive him anyway? But to let him know, this is how it made me feel. And maybe even, I don't want to say teach him a lesson in a wag your finger way, but teaching him something about what it actually means to be like Jesus. Because you could write him a letter and just berate him, or you could say, this, just really keep it, this is how I feel. And then maybe he won't treat other people like that in the future. Yeah. Which is a goal too, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, like, I try to stay a little bit away from this, but, like, Annie, my wife.
I do know her. She's awesome.
She's awesome. She also has a high desire for justice. And so in some ways she's very similar to you in this. Like, if someone's wronged her, and I've tried not to say this the whole episode, but it's like, it just seems I couldn't go any longer without saying so if, like, someone's wronged her, she wants to seek that person out, not to shame them, but because, like, for her to have closure is for that person to apologize, right? Or ask for forgiveness, apologize, whatever. But she'll never say, I need you to say this, but she'll continually create the opportunities for this person. And I remember I had a conversation with her one time, and I don't think she's completely wrong in this, but I was like, I think you're creating way more anguish for yourself by continuing to re-engage in these hurtful places and continue to get let down by the person who's not forgiving you. And, like, I think that you're looking for forgiveness. And so I think, like, that's an interesting...
Looking for an apology.
Yeah, looking for an apology. I think that's an interesting thing for me, as I look at it just in, like, my real life lived experiences. Like, again, like, I think you're providing someone power by, and I think what Dud said is really good, by, like, there's a way to model Christ-like behavior and to, like, process through it. And I wonder, like, but oftentimes it's not enough for us, because, like, I have that bone in my body too. Like, I want you to feel remorse for what you did to me and for you to claim it. But I just don't know how Christ, like, that motive is in me.
Yes. Going back to what you said about, like, I want you to feel this way. There was a part in me that had the hope that maybe he felt so bad that he didn't want to talk to me until last week.
Yeah. And then you were like, oh man, he's just like, he's, as you would say, he was just vibing in it.
Yeah. Just vibing. Bet.
Dead ass.
And so now I can't have that, like, pretend dream anymore. That maybe he feels so much shame about what he did to me, which is what I want. And I know that's horrible and it's not very Christ-like, but that's where I'm at.
But I would say, like, for us in this process, and we said this really early on as we were gassing our podcast up, like, part of it is, like, allowing other people to understand, like, you're not alone. And, like, I think the thing that the three of us, as we've talked about this, have or at least named to some degree, you're not alone or unique in having that feeling.
Yeah.
Like, and I bet people listening feel that way. I hope you know that, like, I mean, you have a big team. I hope you know that outside of us, but, like, for sure, Dustin and I are people that are on your team. I know people listening to this are on your team. And I think by you sharing this, even if you're not in a place like, you know what, I don't know if I can actually extend forgiveness right now. Like, I think you did a bigger act of saying, like, I want to figure out why this is taking up space in my mind right now, which is more than a lot of people would do. And I think as it relates to the conversations we're having on life and faith and deconstruction, I think like that the vulnerability aspect of it is the most Christ-like thing you could do, is to say like, I'm going to openly, vulnerably talk about this with other people, even if I'm not sure what I think about it right now, or if I feel like I'm like wrong in it. I don't know like what you think, but like to engage in the conversation, I think is wonderful.
Thank you. And I think like I guess like if I'm being 100% honest, I was like, I'm gonna bring this up in the episode, and at the end it's gonna be, we killed it. Like now I'm a perfect forgiver. But it's like I think that this like ending this episode here is truer to the deconstruction journey, and I want to be honest about, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think like that's like, I mean, we have episodes start, right? They have natural starts and natural ends, and sometimes we think that's how every part of our spiritual life should be, and our work life and everything.
That's a word right there.
Yeah, and I don't know. Yeah, and I don't know that it is, right? Like I think ending it with ambiguity is saying like the journey's still going, and we say this every week, like embrace the journey. That's part of, you're embracing that part of your journey right now, and being like, I haven't arrived, and I may not arrive ever or for a long time, but it's a part of my journey.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts? Or were you ready to wrap up? I
had 40 more minutes in me. No, no, I think I'm with you. Like, I just think my encouragement would be to anyone listening, like, this is hard stuff. Forgiveness, like, this is maybe the most difficult topic we've dove into because it's wrapped up in our identity and our emotions and our feelings and our hearts and our souls, right? And, like, that's hard stuff to process. We can talk about sin, brokenness, discipleship, like all those things are tangible, but this one like is so deeply personal. And so I think what you said and understanding like this is maybe the most authentic place to end it, to be like, I'm not through it, and I think that's okay.
We could have had a very clean cut episode if we didn't dive into this particular story. We could have talked about forgiveness in the general and been like, there you go guys, that's how you forgive. But this is where the rubber meets the road. Yeah. Like, so I'm still pretty mad. But it's been helpful to like, I think, be heard. And even just the fact that I'm being honest about this story has taken some of the power away. Yeah.
And I don't know why we didn't think about saying this at any point during maybe you did and I just didn't, but like, I think that's what the Psalms are, is like wholehearted, angry, the lament ones. Like there's ones that are very joyful, but like there's a whole section of Psalms that are angry cries to God, sometimes being like, these people messed me up. So I think it's Psalm 88. It's like, God, you've let me down in every way. Like it's the only,
my tears have been my food.
Yeah, it's the only psalm that doesn't end with a hopeful word, and I think like that's sometimes how we feel.
Oh, this is like the Psalm 88 of our podcast.
We got a title.
Is the title just gonna be Psalm 88?
Probably.
People are gonna be like, are you guys just gonna talk about Psalm 88?
This isn't to disparage our audience, but I bet you most people don't know what Psalm 88 is. So.
But I feel like people are gonna be like, I feel like people listening to this would be triggered by just seeing a Bible verse as the title. Or we can argue about this off camera.
Yeah. I would say you'll find out, but by the time you've listened to this episode, you'll have seen the title.
If you've listened to this, you made it through that barrier. So encourage your friends. But yeah, thanks for listening to this pretty vulnerable episode, and embrace the journey.